Tēnā rā koutou katoa, tukuna ana ngā whakamoeneti ki te wāhi ngaro, o tira ki te hunga taketake, nohoi ana ki tēnā whenua, ki tēnā whenua. We acknowledge the Indigenous nations across the globe during this COVID-19 pandemic. Our prayer is that you have shelter, access to running water, food and medicine. May we continue to communicate the challenges of our everyday lived experiences and our reimaginings of social transformation and Indigenous sovereignty grounded in the voices of our whānau, families, Papua Nibi, tribal nations and communities. Pai mārire kia tātou. John G. Oetzel is a professor in the Waikato Management School. He moved to Aotearoa from New Mexico, USA, 9 years ago with his wife and 2 sons. Since that time, he has worked with several Māori health and wellbeing organisations to collaboratively develop interventions related to pre-diabetes and related conditions, positive ageing and housing. These projects have been funded by the National Science Challenges and represent long-standing collaboration with organisations, particularly Rawawāwa Kaumātua Charitable Trust. I am from the tribal nations of Ngāti Kauwhata, Ngāti Kahungungu ki Wairarapa, Ngāti Haua and Ngāti Manipoto. I am a PhD student and a junior researcher at CARE, Centre for Cultural Centred Research and Evaluation, School of Communication, Journalism and Marketing, Massey University. My name is Ngaho Christine Elers. Professor John Oetzel will begin with an overview of the Kaumātua Mana Motuhake project. My presentation will follow, providing an example of a cultural centred approach campaign grounded in the voices of some whānau of a local iwi or tribe who recently resisted local government attempts at confiscating their remaining ancestral land. Over to you, Professor John.
Ngā mihi nui, Christine. So the project that I'm going to talk about is this Kaumātua Mana Motuhake Poi. It's a research project that was funded by the National Science Challenge, and it's set up as a way to address a number of key issues associated with some of the history of colonization within Aotearoa, New Zealand. So I'm speaking, as I see here in this first slide, is on behalf of the KMM POI research team. We're a large team, and I'll share a little bit about us in a second. But first, I want to move to the next slide, where we're talking about some of the key issues for Kaumātua. Kaumātua are Māori elders, and these are some of the key. So I won't spend too much time. Certainly, we could go into a presentation just about the history in New Zealand, but I just want to point out a few key issues that provide a context for what we're trying to do and to point out the type of resistance that we're engaged with. So one key aspect is health inequities. In New Zealand, we Māori have lower health outcomes in many key issues compared to Pākehā or non-Māori or European New Zealanders. So that's one of the key challenges that's being faced. A second is the history of colonization in New Zealand. And a key aspect of colonization, particularly for many Kaumātua today, is the efforts that were done through boarding schools and through different acts and political acts was to remove culture and language, and the effect that this has on Kaumātua. So many Kaumātua are revered in Maori culture, and they have important roles around culture and tikanga or practices, and not having language in that cultural experience can be a challenge for them. The third key issue is the focus on deficit framing in mainstream culture, both towards people who are aging and Maori culture as well. So these are some of the broad challenges that we're trying to face, and rather than accepting these as the dominant frame, our team, led by the Roa Kaumātua Charitable Trust, focused on a different approach. And in the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about the foundations of who we are, and then I'll continue on about our principles. So we're our original partnerships. I mentioned the Ro Awa Komatua Charitable Trust. It's a health and social service provider based in Hamilton, New Zealand, and they cater towards the needs of Komatua in a variety of contexts. It's a large organization, serves over 600 Komatua. It is an organization that was started by Komatua, so it has a vision of providing wraparound services. Researchers, including from Maori Studies and the Management School, have been working together for the past 10 years to develop on a number of different projects. In this new project, we've brought in some new partners, some researchers from other universities, as well as other 10 health and social service providers. So it's a pretty large collaboration to try to address this. We're seeing our common goals. So in the next slide, I'll talk about our particular philosophical approaches towards the foundation of our project. And basically what we're trying to do is center our research around a kaupapa Māori philosophy. That means by Māori for Māori, or in our case, by Komatua for Komatua. So the projects that we have, the research that we're doing is driven by Komatua interests. They're part of defining the problem, defining the solutions. So they lead and guide our work. It's also a strength-based approach. So we're focusing on the assets that Komatua have, their mana motuhake, their potential, their abilities, their self-actualization. So seeing the strength that they have in the culture and the ability to address their own challenges in a way that's mana or status enhancing. It's also very much a participatory approach. So we work collaboratively from the bottom up rather than going in and saying, here's what needs to be done. It's the Komatua saying, this is what we'd like done. Can you help us? And we work together in this manner. So in the next slide, I want to talk about one of the key elements about our partnership. We call this the Kotahitanga Research Network. And Kotahitanga means unity. So we're looking at how we do this together. And our network is composed of 11 service providers, as well as researchers from 4 different universities. We also have members from the Ministry of Health and other social service agencies that provide expert guidance. And we meet regularly, roughly 2 to 3 times a year, and we find common interests and common goals that we want to work on. It includes, so we're focused on advocacy and capacity development, and trying to develop communication channels to create change. So our form of resistance is to not accept the dominant forms, but to try to use collective advocacy on behalf of Komatua. So in the next slide, my final slide is what we're doing is a research perspective is we're developing 2 novel interventions with our research partners that center on Komatua capacity and Komatua strengths. One is a peer educator model where Komatua help other Komatua identify service needs and create social connectedness to address loneliness. The second is a project we call Matoranga Tuku Iho, which basically is knowledge held by Komatua, and the project is to help them share their matoranga or knowledge with younger members of their whānau, and also engage in physical activity. So it's kind of combining a couple of aspects. So this is our form of resistance, is to identify strengths that we can use to address key challenges. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Oetzel. He's going to pop back in at the end to deliver a short conclusion. And so now we'll carry on to my presentation, which is about a campaign called What We Say Matters. It's a CCA campaign grounded in the voices of some whānau members of the local iwi of Ngāti Kauwhata and Fielding, Manawatu, Aotearoa, New Zealand. I am also of Ngāti Kauwhata, The campaign is an example of Indigenous resistance against local government attempts at seizing ancestral land in order to build a stop bank to prevent flooding that happens once every 100 years in the region. The photos in this part of the presentation are of an ancestral land occupation by some whānau of Ngāti Kaupata and were taken during the campaign earlier this year. Further information can be found on the hashtag What We Say Matters Facebook page. Professor Mohan Datta, he is the architect of the CCA. The CCA has over 2 decades of cultural centred interventions. Therefore, this panel provides examples of new frontiers of CCA interventions. Indigenous resistance is just one of the examples. In the context of the What We Say Matters campaign, and at the intersections of culture, structure and agency, whānau members articulated their meanings of health and wellbeing. They then came together to form an advisory group, a community advisory group called the Fielding Advisory Group. In these articulations, the oppressive nature of structures, particularly in healthcare, were vividly narrated, and land was identified as an integral part of health and wellbeing. Whānau members within the iwi whose voices aren't typically heard in mainstream and tribal spaces constitute the advisory group. Generally, Indigenous peoples who live in colonial settler states such as Aotearoa, New Zealand, have experienced marginalisation. The CCA delves deeper and looks further to the margins of communities because structural inequalities, they go hand in hand with communicative inequalities. Building voice infrastructures creates openings for voice as the basis of social change transformation, centering whānau on the margins as the experts of their own realities. As voices emerge into hegemony or mainstream communicative spaces, oppressive processes are unmasked and interrogated. An example in this campaign is the local government stop bank proposal consultation process. It was revealed as inept because most of the kaitiaki or the landowners were not consulted, and those that were consulted reported that their voices weren't being listened to. The latter pointed to a deeper concern that even though the stop bank location proposal was rejected by the tribal members who attended the consultation meetings, the local government proceeded to possess the remaining ancestral land anyway. If there are any policymakers, government representatives watching, then there is one message I'd like you to hear regarding the modern day confiscation of ancestral land. Don't do it. Exhaust all other options and refrain from attempting a flawed consultation process, which essentially means that it is a tick box exercise. If you do, expect tribal communities to call you out and mobilise. As part of the cultural centred process, I worked with an advisory group constituted organically by the whānau members from the margins of the community. That advisory group had been working with the erasure of their voices when the Stop Bank project started. The decision to occupy the land and protest emerged from dialogue with the advisory group, brainstorming on communication strategies and an overall framework for a campaign and the structure of the campaign. They co-created storyboards and visual materials to voice their feelings of erasure amidst the colonial decision-making process. Richard Torres, care technical producer, co-created videos with the whānau. Kowhata Marae trustees opened up the iwi marae, which is just located a few hundred metres down the road, for bathroom and cooking facilities for the land occupiers. In this campaign, no tribal leaders or representatives were present. No iwi academics lent their support, and there are many academics in my iwi. Only myself, Pooja, Jayan, Thara Papaga, Debalina and Professor Mohan Datta from the academe through care stood in solidarity with the whānau. There is no water, power or shelter on the land, and the adjacent river is too polluted to access drinking water. This ancestral land occupation was a grassroots effort, built and sustained mostly by whānau living on the margins of our iwi. So my next message, which is a question for tribal leaders and or representatives, how do you build communication infrastructures to ensure that any social justice transformation strategies are grounded in the voices of the margins of your tribe or nation? Please reflect on this, and if you need some assistance, feel free to contact us at CARE. My last question is for Indigenous scholars. How are you placing your bodies on the line in solidarity with marginalised whānau in your tribal nations and with other like-minded scholars of colour in the academy? The path towards social justice transformation requires us to do more than writing articles and presenting. The final and most compelling statements in this presentation is from the voices of the whānau, many of whom comprise the Fielding Advisory Group.
The confiscation of our land was the confiscation of our identity. The negative impact on our people has led to loss of tikanga, loss of language, poverty, homelessness, suicide, high crime rates, addiction, and so much more. Forced and beaten into a colonised way of living. This has affected generations before me and will be felt by generations after me.
What we say matters.
Horizons Regional Council, which is local government, ceased the stop bank construction on this ancestral land. On the 21st of March 2020, they reinstated the land to the whānau of Ngāti Kaipata. Thank you for watching. I'll now hand back over to Professor John.
Katiake rā, e mihi ana ki a koto mo o koto totoko. E whakakapi ake ki ngā korero a ngā tupuna. Kaua e mate wheke, mate ururoa. No reira tēnā koto, tēnā koto, tēnā tātou kotoa. I've closed with a whakatoki or proverb that said, don't die like the octopus, die like the hammerhead shark. It's a testament to the importance of resistance and standing up in the face of challenges. And there are different ways to do this, as we've demonstrated in these two presentations. And we hope that this has been useful information for you. Thank you very much for taking the time to listen.